Hello, my name's Juliette Challenger and I'm a legal director and head of transaction management at Nordic Trustee.
And I'm Aric K. Russell. I'm a director at Nordic Trustee.
And Aric and I are here today to talk about developments and issues in the ever evolving landscape of the world of restructuring.
So, given that, Juliette, that we're here to talk about the restructuring market, what do you see as the actual current trends?
Well, one aspect that we've seen is following the pandemic, there was an anticipated wave of restructurings that was due to occur. But given the liquidity support that was provided to companies, that hasn't actually come to fruition. And what we've seen, instead of there being a wave, there's been more of a gradual increase in restructurings in several different guises. So typically over the last year throughout 2024 and into 2025, we've seen restructurings becoming a bit more prevalent. There being various different restructuring ways. So looking at everything from consensual restructurings through to more formal restructuring processes. Some of that restructuring demand or just restructuring activity has been driven by various different factors. So thinking about the geopolitical landscape, increased costs, market volatility, sector-specific issues as well. So the construction industry facing particular issues with increased rising costs, rising labour demands, increased prices of raw materials, and all of that's really driving restructuring activity.
What do we mean when we're actually talking about the term restructurings?
Well, restructuring covers a broad range of different types of transactions. Essentially, that can be broken down into two main parts. So on the one hand, a consensual restructuring, and on the other hand, non-consensual restructurings. So looking at consensual restructurings, you're looking at really an amend and extend, where existing facilities are amended in terms of their covenants and additional liquidity may be provided by additional lenders, and also looking at refinancings, which is another way of achieving a consensual restructuring. That may be preferable for parties given that it can be lower cost without having some costs associated with a more formal restructuring or indeed a litigation. But also it tends to be a quicker process if you've got all the various parties and stakeholders engaging with each other, and achieves a position that preserves value within the company and enables all parties to achieve their ultimate aims. Looking at non-consensual restructurings, there's a variety of different ways that can be achieved, one of which is through the distress disposal mechanisms in the intercreditor agreement. Another way would be through a more formal process such as a CVA or scheme of arrangement, although both of those seem to have dwindled slightly in popularity in favour of the restructuring plan, which, as you know, was brought into being to provide a more formalised, structured plan to assist with these restructurings. And that's been tested quite significantly in recent times through the courts to establish parameters around what is permitted under that plan. So those types of restructurings are more formal. They are a court process, so driven by court timetables and specific requirements. As I mentioned, the recent cases that we're seeing through restructuring plans being brought through the courts are developing that, developing the processes and principles around how the restructuring plan can be used, and looking at how to ensure that creditors' positions are protected.
So, what are the factors driving restructurings?
There are several factors to be taken into consideration. I mentioned the macroeconomic situation, the geopolitical landscape, but also there are several other factors such as new entrants into the market. So what we've seen in the last few years are there are different market participants who have engaged in finance transactions who are maybe taking a slightly different approach to protecting their position in transactions and really utilising the documentation and various avenues within the documentation to seek to protect their position and preserve value. So that's really opening up a different avenue through potential up-tier transactions and drop-down transactions that we've seen being very popular in the US and seeing a little bit coming into the European market. But I think the landscape is also evolving due to the developments being made at a regulatory level, so in a variety of jurisdictions. I've mentioned the restructuring plan that's being utilised in the UK, but there are developments in other European jurisdictions. For example, in Germany, the Aric procedure. In the Netherlands, there's the Dutch WOA process. And all of these developments in the restructuring toolkit really are open to creditors and companies to utilise. And that's all really driving the appetite for looking at various different restructuring avenues.
So having said all of that, what are the things that trustee needs to consider when it enters into a restructuring arrangement at the obvious direction at the relevant parties?
Well, trustees really do play a pivotal role in the restructurings, whether they're consensual or non-consensual. Typically, much greater involvement in non-consensual restructuring, but essentially the trustee there is the key to communication with all the stakeholders, and it's incumbent really on the trustee to ensure that they know the transaction, they are aware of what are the parameters of the documentation, to anticipate what they may need to be involved in or may be requested of them. Now, each restructuring is completely different, which makes it that's what makes it exciting to be involved in them, and sometimes difficult to predict what the outcome may be. But all parties really are looking to continue the company as a going concern, and it's really the trustee's role to ensure that it acts within the parameters of the documentation, it acts within its legal obligations and fiduciary obligations, but that it really uses its experience to assist parties and facilitate the restructuring and the various steps that are involved. Now, depending on which route is taken, there will be different requirements of the trustee, and so really it's for the trustee to fully know the transaction inside out, understand the documentation, understand what the security is, know its stakeholders and the parties that it should be communicating with, be able to identify those parties. Now, that's a key challenge for the trustee in identifying various creditors, note holders, ensuring that we're speaking to the right people and communicating with the right people, ensuring that those people have the right to receive that information, and making sure that we're taking the interests of the relevant class of creditor as a whole into account, where they're in these restructurings being driven by an ad hoc group or a steering committee, ensuring that as a trustee we know who we are to be communicating with and liaising with, and in whose interest we're acting. So some of these processes can be extremely complex, particularly where you're dealing with multi-jurisdictional transactions spanning several different jurisdictions. Sometimes dealing with transactions that are involving various different processes in various jurisdictions.
So you mean that you can actually run parallel schemes in different jurisdictions, for instance, UK, or, I mean, we, being Nordic Trustee, we have a fair amount of experience in the Nordic region. So you can have parallel schemes in the UK and maybe Sweden or elsewhere?
Correct, yeah, absolutely. And that's where it gets interesting and complex. We've been involved in a number of transactions with our colleagues in the Nordics where we've been acting simultaneously on a Chapter 11 process in the US,
Right.
a Swedish restructuring, but also a restructuring under English law. And so pulling all of those processes together and understanding the dynamics and the requirements of each of those processes and being able to coordinate those, stay on top of the requirements and participate in those is time consuming and challenging, but where you have an experienced trustee that's familiar with operating and running those types of, or assisting in running those types of processes, it becomes helpful to the transaction for the trustee to have that experience. Of course, another challenge that the trustee faces is in a situation where it is involved in any litigation that is linked to any kind of restructuring. Where there's a non-consensual restructuring, and as we've seen in various cases that have come before the courts recently, those restructurings can turn to litigation. And in that situation, again, the trustee will perform a pivotal role in ensuring that there is communication between the parties, but also itself being a party to the proceedings, either from the get-go or joined in as a party through the course of the proceedings. The trustee really needs to be familiar with the process that's required, whether that's within England or other jurisdictions, because again, you may have concurrent litigations running in various jurisdictions. And really, the trustee would then need to ensure that it is in a position where it is properly advised, so taking advice from external counsel, but also that its costs will be covered. Now, obviously, that's quite a sensitive issue, but it is an important one for the trustee, as it needs to be advised properly, but also ensure that any indemnity coverage is in place, but that coverage being adequate and proportionate. And so again, really requires a trustee with experience to understand what risks may be involved in that litigious situation and be able to negotiate the adequate protections that's proportionate to the situation it finds itself in.
Yeah. So basically, in summary, what we're saying is that we need to sort of have a trustee that can really know and understand a transaction inside out.
That's key, I'd say.
Know what the parties are actually looking to achieve, I guess,
Absolutely.
would be another critical matter. To understand processes, practicalities, what actually it and the other transaction parties are actually stepping into in order to effectively create a smoother process through the restructuring as possible. Would that be a fair summary?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay. As a trustee, so what type of involvement do you think we have in a contentious restructuring? Have we already covered this bit?
Well, as I mentioned, the communication with the parties is key. But I think from a practical perspective, what we've seen is, depending on what route is being taken, there's a number of ways in which the trustee is involved. So looking at, for example, security enforcement, in the past, been involved in numerous security enforcements, particularly share pledge enforcements. I recall a particular time where the requirements of the transaction were that the security trustee was required to be at the place that the enforcement was taking place. So it was one of the first of its kind in a European jurisdiction, where a share pledge enforcement was being effected, and the security trustee was required to be present with all the creditors in the days leading up to the enforcement and on the day of enforcement to actually ensure that the proper process was effected in person. And so that's what the trustee may be called to be involved in from a practical perspective in a security enforcement. Likewise, when looking at, say, distress disposals, the trustee can be heavily involved in that process. So as part of ensuring that the distress disposal is effected correctly, the intercreditor agreement will usually contain detailed provisions on how that process is to be affected and how
Right.
that's to play out. As part of that, there's usually an option for a fairness opinion to be obtained, and one of the trustees' responsibilities will be to ensure that a financial advisor is appointed in order to carry out that fairness opinion and the related valuation of the business, in order to ensure that the acquisition price that is chosen for the disposal is a fair one. And having had personal experience of being involved in the beauty parades to select the relevant advisor to ensure that the firm selected has the requisite skills, experience and
presumably knowledge and also independence, I suppose, is actually quite a critical factor in that as well, isn't it?
Absolutely. So ensuring that firm is selected on the correct basis, and that's something again that's perhaps not always considered in the day-to-day of a trustee, but is something that then becomes a key component to a process such as the distress disposal requiring a fairness opinion.
Yeah, it's really interesting because obviously, I guess, ordinarily you would expect the trustee to sort of stand in the wings a little bit, but it certainly seems in these instances when things are getting a little bit more contentious or a little bit more distressed, that they have to take a very much more active role in participating and in trying to ensure that these steps and processes are carried through correctly.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, with restructuring plans or schemes of arrangement that are through a court-appointed process, the trustee again is at the forefront of that, being involved in the communication side of things, but also, as I've mentioned, going through any kind of litigation.
Yeah.
The trustee will be required to input into the statement of claim or the statement of defence, will be required to provide its own witness statements, and in many occasions actually appear in court and present itself in court. So the practical challenges facing trustees are that they will be involved heavily in those types of processes.
Right, yeah. They're not the only ones, of course. I mean, the agents also actually, particularly when you get to sort of court-sanctioned or court-arranged proceedings, the agents actually also have quite a critical role in this as well, particularly the tabulation agents who come in and they're appointed as, by the company to ensure that the requisite sort of consent process is followed correctly prior to court hearings. So, we've had experience, of course, with running these sort of exercises and the number of witness statements and affidavits that need to be signed by the agent in order to sort of absolutely testify and certify that the number crunching is done correctly has, becomes quite a critical component to ensure that the requisite consents actually pass in order for things to be actually, brought before the court and the court can actually sanction these things. So, it's not just the trustee that gets all the fun.
Very true, very true. So, and that's a very good point, Aric. So looking at agents, we've been focusing more in the discussion on more of the formal restructuring processes. But there are also ways in which restructurings can be, other ways in which restructurings can be affected. Could you tell us a little bit about that, please? Sure.
They're broadly termed as LME exercises, so liability management, and there's a fairly broad range of alternatives available to companies in distress. So you can go anywhere through amend and extends, obviously consensual restructurings, as we've been discussing earlier, but also tender offers, exchange offers, which will lead to, or debt for equity swaps, alternatives that allow holders of notes to be involved in the process to ensure that the company survives and, actually more importantly for the note holders, of course, their investment retains at least some value. As agent, we are generally appointed by the issuer to help affect these things. Once again, going back to a lot of what you were saying, an agent's function is really very much to ensure that it facilitates an open line of communication between the issuer or lender, actually, if it's a loan, and its holders and its investors. Most of that, if you've got a cleared bond, for instance, will actually be done through the clearing systems. We have very strong connections with and very strong relationships with the likes of Euroclear and Clearstream. And those parties are instrumental in helping us to facilitate and to ensure that lines of communication and restructurings, the sort of the nuts and bolts of restructuring, are effected as efficiently as possible. The difficulty we find with most restructurings is, or with bonds and bonds in general when they're cleared, is that nobody really quite knows who the investors actually are at any given time. We as agents can help with running bondholder communication exercises and encouraging bondholders to come forward and identify themselves so that the company has a starting point with parties it is able to actually discuss matters with. Often we find that, particularly when you have a bond which a sort of a strong institutional investment, that a lot of the institutional investors will come together and club together and form a steering or an ad hoc committee. And they are probably the parties that drive the direction which restructuring is going to head into. And, we as agent, and actually I think as trustee as well, I think it's fair to say, would have ought to have very strong lines of communication and sort of an open discussion with those parties to sort of help affect the planned direction.
And what about the involvement in relation to convening note holder meetings?
Once again, going back to that, we would run most of the information through the clearing systems.
Okay.
So all information is disseminated through those whilst you're acting as an agent on a cleared bond. But increasingly, previously there was sort of we would collate information as tabulation agent or information agent and deal with not just with consent, but also, for instance, with the documentation behind a scheme. There's a huge convening bundle of documentation for sort of the convening the scheme, but also actually getting the consents. Part of the whole process of a restructuring outside of an amend and extend is the thing that comes out at the other end. So what you've obviously got a current distressed instrument, but the purpose of the restructuring is to turn it into something else. The information agent acts as helps to facilitate questions that come back from investors as to what their entitlements will be, what proportions and such. This is all normally contained in a document that gets distributed or is posted or hosted on portals. But the information agent's role in that is to ensure that portal is maintained. It also helps to convene physical, or these days actually, rather more than physical note holder meetings. Often there are electronic ones as well, so done through the likes of Teams. Microsoft Teams actually you can host has the sort of the technical capability of hosting large numbers of bondholders who wish to join these meetings, and it's information agents now find that they need to have a technical ability to actually have and be able to fully utilize these platforms in order to actually host these meetings.
So with all this in mind, how can Nordic Trustee help parties with their restructurings?
Nordic Trustee's got over 30 years of experience doing complex restructurings. I believe we've got a historic record of up to about 450, reaching towards 500 over that time. And I suppose what we offer is independent, conflict-free expertise. We can help facilitate the pathway and help guide people through elements of these restructurings from a trustee's perspective.
So looking at the services that Nordic Trustee can offer,
We are looking at facility agent, security agent, bond trustee, escrow agent, all of the agents. So
All of the agents, yep, and certain bespoke ones that have come up recently, such as holding period trustee, which is a bit of a niche, a niche role that allows parties once we've had the end result of a restructuring will hold for a portion of time the entitlements that parties who haven't come forward to provide their consent in trust until such time as they come forward in order to collect their entitlements. So certainly on that side of things, we do offer all manner of agents, trust and agent services as well. But I think also it should be noted that being part of Acorian, we're also able to offer other services such as SPVs for balance sheet restructurings that allow assets to be transferred from distressed companies into clean companies, from which we've seen in the past quite a popular way of issuing new instruments out of these clean orphan vehicles.
And with that, also providing independent directors for those vehicles and all of the corporate administration services through Acorian, which is Nordic Trustee is obviously an Acorian company. So really the whole spectrum from cradle to grave, so to speak.
Absolutely.
SPV services
Yep.
To establish the orphan SPV issuer or borrower, through the agency roles of facility agent, security agent, escrow agent, but also we can offer paying agent and settlement agent services.
That's right.
Together with the bond trustee roles and the corporate services that we mentioned.
Absolutely. That's right.
So I think we could probably sit here for the rest of the day and talk about all things restructurings, and there's several things that we haven't really gone into too much detail on around the some of the recent decisions on the restructuring plans, which have thrown up some very interesting issues and interesting judgments, where the Court of Appeal has overturned various decisions, and that's ongoing. So I think the restructuring landscape will continue to evolve and will be an incredibly exciting place to work. So if there's any way in which Nordic Trustee can help parties navigate that process and the landscape, then we'd be more than happy to help. So please do reach out to any of your Nordic Trustee contacts if you'd like any more information.